Hello, everyone. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you. It's an exciting topic. It's also a topic that can drag on for hours and hours if we let it, right? So I'm going to try and condense it into a 45-minute presentation over here. I thought we'll start off perhaps just with a few simple questions to gauge your familiarity with AI, your familiarity with this topic overall, and then, it also helps me understand where the room is, and then we can jump in, right? So to start with, right, just show of hands. I guess how many of you have purchased or owned cryptocurrency? I think you should go find a new financial advisor. This is not that session, but I would highly recommend finding a new financial advisor. Now, jokes aside, what about VR, AR? Yeah, fair enough. Okay. What about Gen AI? How many of you have at least played around with Gen AI tools? Amazing, right? And I think this is the key part of this, right? I think we've had a lot of technological advancements throughout, right? We had blockchain become, somewhat of a hype and a fad, if you will, right? We're seeing VR and AR being used across multiple places. But unlike all of these preceding technologies and improvements that have been made, I think what's very, very different about Gen AI is I think everyone universally understands this. Everyone universally is able to adopt this. Everyone's intrigued by this. And I think that's different about this, right? So we'll explore that in a little bit more detail when we go through this today, right? And I'll talk to you about some practical applications with this as well, right? More focused on supply chain, but we'll certainly touch upon various elements associated with this, right? So as I mentioned, we'll cram this into, the next 40 minutes here. Start first and foremost with just overview and trends, right? What do we mean when we say Gen AI, right? Just some basic foundational elements. Where's the market going with this overall? What's the art of the possible with it, if you will, right? We'll then make it a little bit more real, right? For any of you who have, some experience with operations or interact with folks who are in operations, right? Anywhere from planning, manufacturing, distribution, what does this mean from that standpoint, right? And I'll start sharing some demos and use cases that have been proven. So it doesn't seem very hypothetical, but we can actually, look to see what the art of the possible here is. And then obviously, as I said, we'll discuss throughout, but happy to leave some time towards the end for questions as well. Yeah, good. So first, 5 key takeaways with Gen AI. One, as I mentioned, very, very firmly a believer this is not a fad. I think this is a transformational technology, and you can just see with the show of hands, right? I mean, this is the newest technology, and I think most everyone actually has had an opportunity to interact with it already. Gen AI is often thought of as just creating text. It does a lot more than text, right? We'll talk about all the potential opportunities with it and how might you actually adopt it in terms of all the various types of content it can create. Of course, I think the prevalent fear is this is something that is going to replace humans, right? And look, there may be some truth to it, right? But at least everything we're seeing so far is it's augmenting human capabilities. We do need humans in the loop. With AI, at least the more traditional form of AI, in the past, we've seen something called algorithmic aversion, right? Basically, we as humans are very happy to take suggestions from AI if it's recommending a movie to watch on Netflix. But if it was AI that actually makes a recommendation in terms of a prognosis, that's high stakes and we're not willing to take that. Even if you can empirically show that AI would do a better job with it, we wouldn't accept it, right? The one thing that changed that phenomenon was if you actually inserted some amount of control over the output with the human beings, right? And I think that's what's different with Gen AI, right? It allows us to be somewhat in the driver's seat with it. So the outcomes of this are a lot more accepted, right? So that's something that's really interesting. And as I said, doesn't replace us, but we do need to be in the loop with it. Number 4 goes right along with it. It creates content, sometimes good, sometimes bad. I was playing around with the latest version of the OpenAI algorithm. It's Alpha Model 4.0. The older version could actually spell strawberry and tell you how many R's were in strawberry. The newer version can't spell strawberry and can't tell you how many R's there are, right? So there is some element of just needing to have a human set of eyes and content expertise and functional expertise still in the loop, especially as these are still progressing. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, I think there's a tremendous potential for good, tremendous potential for value creation here. But this has to be managed responsibly and ethically, right? And I think that's on all of us to make sure that we do structure it in a way that those are those safeguards and put in place. And it has to be the first lens that we look at this as we think about it from the standpoint of what are its applications, right? Okay. So traditional AI, right? Traditional AI typically thought of as single purpose, right? Really intended to go after just one particular outcome, right? As in the example over here, classifying tumors, right? Generative AI really multi-purpose, right? Not only do you help me classify a tumor, but really help me write a report and help me follow up on several actions and pull up the latest research, etc. So there's multiple purposes that can come along with this. And that really, I think, allows us to fold this into our daily flow of work in a way that we really couldn't with traditional AI. Traditional AI already mind-boggled me in terms of the amount of data that it would crunch. With generative AI, I don't even know the terms in terms of the data that it's crunching anymore, right? But it is got a wealth of data at its fingertips, and I think that's just helping it evolve in ways that are very, very interesting overall. I think as I said, right, we'll talk a little bit about the multiple output modalities in a second. So how does this work, right? For those of you who had the misfortune like me of having to code things in Excel when we first started off, right? I think we wrote very, very painful rule-based formulas to try and automate a lot of processes, right? Still in existence today, and I think still has its place. Then we started moving towards machine learning, right? And I could keep up with this, right? I understood what this was fundamentally, right? There was a specific area where you were essentially going to go back, retrain the models to say, continue to adjust your parameters to make sure that the output, let's say we're trying to forecast something, you're changing parameters in terms of, how long are you actually looking back for data set? Which data set do you prioritize versus not, right? And that worked, right? Then we got to deep learning and I was lost. Neural networks, right? Same concept in theory, right? But a lot more complex in terms of what it could do and a lot more complex in terms of the outputs that it could provide as well, right? Some richness with it on that front. And then here we are at Gen AI, right? And my expectation is that, I'm not going to be able to follow this as this keeps up, but I can actually follow this, right? And I'm not a techie guy to start with, right? I can't code to save my life. But this is something that, fundamentally is easy for us to understand. Yes, the underlying platform is very, very complex, right? But how you interact with this, how does this actually solve for, is rather simple to understand, right? It is in essence guessing what every next character should be. As you type out the text, it is guessing. It is guessing what every next character should be. And that's why it gets the spelling of strawberry wrong sometimes, right? Even though you spell out strawberry, but it is guessing, hence generative AI, right? But there's a power in it, right? It's essentially pulling together essentially the world's data, looking at various patterns, looking at how people are essentially solving for problems, training itself, and then it is guessing to say, I am now bringing this back to you. Something similar with me, right? You all are going to ask me a question and I'm going to guess to think about, what's the answer that might resonate with you today, right? That's the same thing that it's trying to do overall, right? So very close to how we're thinking, very close to how we're actually processing a lot of things. So it becomes really easy for us to really engage with generative AI overall, right? What can it do? Really today we're seeing 4 primary modalities with this. Text generation is the one that I think most of us are familiar with, right? We see this play out every day. It works incredibly well in some settings. It does not in some settings, right? The challenge with this is, again, it's when you think about traditional AI, it was more deterministic. 2 plus 2 was always going to be 4, right? With generative AI, there is an opportunity that as you tweak things and as it evolves, 2 plus 2 might not always come back as 4, right? But, when you're thinking about how can I create something new, for example, I have to write a medical report, right? For example, I have to go through and clean a certain set of data with it, right? Inherently, human tasks with this are error riddled, right? In those instances, we're seeing generative AI is actually more accurate and gives you a better starting point, right? But if you're looking for generative AI to be very, very specific and can repeat and come back with the same consistent process or same consistent output every single time, then it's not a great place for you to go with text generation, right? Media generation, really exciting, but also honestly really scary. Can take my voice recording from this conference here, and then can essentially reproduce it with my accent in any language that you might want it to, right? A bit scary, but also, the possibilities of this, again, if it's done ethically and managed responsibly, really, really powerful from that standpoint overall, right? Design generation, I think this is, very exciting, and I would say also rather emerging at this point of time. We're starting to see a lot of medtech companies, a lot of biopharma companies really think about how can they bring in generative AI as part of the overall R&D processes and the design processes, right? Um, and I think the potential there and the promise there is quite impressive. And then lastly, code generation, right? For all the types of activities that we're trying to do and all the types of automation that we're trying to run through, code generation really is quite top notch from this standpoint, right? So these are the four primary modalities that we're seeing in terms of just where generative AI is going, right? All right. Why does this matter? I think when we were looking at the possibilities with this, the productivity gains, they're immediate and they're real. Um, we're seeing essentially, use cases where Gen AI is able to identify novel drugs in a matter of days, right? Obviously, with humans in the loop, right? Versus potentially traditionally months and years of research, right? Now, is it going to happen every single time? No, right? But the possibility of that really creates that black swan event, right? And that's impressive productivity overall. I had mentioned the example of medical writing before, right? We're seeing that tasks cut down by 60%, right? And if you're honest with it, I don't think anyone truly enjoys medical writing. But this is something that does it for you, gets you there, and you can finish off the final product associated with it. The barriers to Gen AI are low. Every one of us in this room has already played around with this, right? One of my senior clients at a biopharma company, roughly 30 billion in revenues, head of global supply chain. I had a chance actually, 6 years ago, to sit down with him and help him transform his company through traditional AI, right? And he said, look, my gosh, I have to go through and relearn all of these things, right? And he would actually sit down with one of the data scientists on the team and just have him explain, how does this work? What does this mean? What do you mean by machine learning? What's the mechanics of it? What do I mean by neural network? When am I actually picking model A versus model B, etc., right? In the last few months, as I have those same conversations with him, it's kind of looking back at this and going, I feel like I learned all of this for no good. I should have just waited for Gen AI and it would have been a lot simpler and easier for me to go about this. There's some truth to this, right? I think it's really made it easy for all of us to be able to adopt this. I think one of the key elements over here, right, that we saw in 2 months, there were 100 million users on OpenAI. Never before has that happened, right? And we're starting to see, and I'll go into this in another slide. At the moment, as per our surveys, there's only 5% of companies, especially in healthcare, that are not okay with their employees actually using generative AI. Everyone else is embedded it in some shape or form. So the barrier to entry on this one really is very, very low compared to most of the other technologies that we've seen, right? Lastly, in terms of just what do we expect to see in terms of overall growth? Look, we think this will create significant opportunities within enterprises. We think it'll create significant opportunities for new businesses overall. The overall total addressable market, TAM, by 2027, right, we think will be roughly $121 billion. Healthcare is a big part of it, and we see healthcare actually growing more than any other part of the economy as far as Gen AI is concerned. Historically, healthcare has always been one of the laggards in terms of adopting AI, in terms of adopting technology. On this one, they're not, right? I think they are indeed embracing this. I think they see the potential associated with this across the value chain. So we're seeing that. So as I mentioned, right, we sampled a few of our clients to say, where are you on your generative AI journey, right? 50% say they're experimenting with something, right? So basically that means, a lot of folks in their organization have access to, either Anthropic, OpenAI, whatever it is, but they're experimenting with it, right? 25%, right? If you think about that number in context with when OpenAI was made officially available to the world, right? 25% of healthcare companies are saying we're deploying and trying to scale, right? 6 years ago, if I had this conversation with you about traditional AI, I promise you that number would not have been as high for traditional AI, right? Despite that being available for nearly a decade at that point of time, right? And this is what's exciting and also scary about this element, right? 20% are also thinking about what comes next in their organization, right? So this is the transformative elements, right? What is really the art of the possible? Where should I really focus? Am I falling behind? And then 5%, as I said, have locked their organizations out of it, right? For good concerns, obviously, right? But that's a minority at this point of time, and I don't expect them to stay there for much longer, right? What are we seeing today, right? Across the board, right? As I said, obviously, a lot of use cases, a lot of adoption at this point of time. Every single participant in this healthcare ecosystem today is playing around with Gen AI, is seeing some value of Gen AI for their particular organizations. Pharma, we talked about accelerated drug deployment. Medtech, I think the two big areas, I'll show you one of the demos today. Supply chain risk identification is a big one. And what do you do about it, right? And then also really thinking about it from the standpoint of product design itself, right? Both of them are emerging. I wouldn't say they're validated and proven. They're emerging at this point of time, but real potential on that front. When we think about providers, certainly we are seeing that from the standpoint of just automated document processing. We're seeing that in terms of image recognition, etc. So there's a lot of, I think, pull across this ecosystem, and I think it's just going to get more powerful as it goes on. This is an important one, right? Look, unless you're, at the cutting edge of technology in terms of actually developing the next large language models, what I think all of us should be focused on is the 70% under the people, process, and policy, right? The platform will catch up, right? There will be evolutions associated with it. There will be new things associated with this. But look, that's not where we will innovate, right? I think where we will innovate here is really around how do we help embed this within our processes in such a way that our people can really benefit from it, right? We got to prevent against also cognitive offloading, right? I think one of the key factors with Gen AI is it's an immediate equalizer, right? I think you can bring in someone who's fresh out of college and say, hey, look, write a document related to X. It's an immediate equalizer, right? They can bring that quality of their document to near at par for someone who's perhaps been in that role for 2-3 years, if you will, right? But with cognitive offloading, what does that mean, right? We're not really learning what this process means. We're not really understanding what that means. And therefore, our ability to innovate then gets hampered over a period of time, right? So instead of seeing that differentiation, instead of really allowing for those outliers to go through and experiment and innovate and push the boundaries, we're sort of bringing everyone up to a median and just, stagnating at that point. So we got to really think about that, right? And that's why I think this is the part that we really need to be focused on, right? What is the people? What's the process? What's the policy? Yes, you want to be able to bring up the median where it makes sense, but you need to preserve the environment for people to really be able to continue to dive into things, learn the skills needed to be able to innovate. Otherwise, I think you risk stagnation overall, right? So that's a big downside that I think you need to protect against, and that's one of the big elements associated with this. Data model in cybersecurity, like I said, I think that will keep coming along. And yes, there's going to be trade-offs and choices to be made in terms of, which large language model am I using? Who's my service provider associated with it, right? But I think the differences associated with that aren't going to be as major as the ones associated with people, process, and policy overall, right? Does that make sense? This sometimes feels a little, non-intuitive to folks. I think most people, myself included, for the most part, always gravitates towards the tech side of things, right? This is the new shiny toy, right? And that's the one that I really want to play with. But the people and process side of things often are somewhat second nature, right? So just wanted to pause and see if there's any reflections, any questions.
So you're talking about the 5% that aren't joining. Is that from security or intellectual property reasons?
For the most part, yes. Right. And I think, especially in its early days, I think there was a lot of questions around what happens to my IP. Right. If I'm typing something in, is that available to everyone in the world? Right.
And what's their answer?
And I think most companies on this front that are providing platforms have figured out a way to essentially sandbox it. Right. So the data that I enter as part of BCG into a generative AI platform that I have stays within my company's four walls, right? It's not available anywhere else, but we have the ability to access everything else from an LLM standpoint, right? So that's helped in a major way, right? The other part of this is, I think there's some questions around just the overall ethical aspects of this, right? I think, some instances of clear bias when this has been implemented as part of HR policies have been picked up on, right? So I think there's a bit of trepidation around, I'm not quite sure what the impacts of this are, and I really want to think through that. The primary concern is IP. The secondary concern over there is just some of the ethical concerns associated with it.
Thank you.
Yeah, good. Anything else? Thank you for that question, by the way. All right. Okay, so what should companies focus on, and where are they focusing on this, right? On the bottom are what I would call non-core use cases, right? What do I mean by that, right? We all have, scores of teams essentially, writing code on an everyday basis to either automate a process, to help stand up a new application, whatever that might be, right? Table stakes, low barrier to entry. I think nearly everyone's going to adopt these to just drive more efficiency within their organizations, right? And we're going to see that, I think, increasingly occur over the next year, 2 years. Then what I would call the core or the golden use cases, right? How do I really think about leveraging these models to develop something that is uniquely our IP that helps me drive a competitive advantage, right? I go back to R&D, right? I think it's a phenomenal use case on that front, right? If you're able to leverage Gen AI in a way to help you accelerate or come up with innovative designs, that gives you a competitive advantage. That is not something that you and I can just go type into a Gemini or a ChatGPT and say, hey, find me a new drug, right? There is a lot of engineering work that needs to take place to be able to feed in the data that's pertinent. There's a lot of smart prompting that needs to occur to be able to engineer your use case again that provides you with the right kind of outputs that you can then take and innovate on, right? And that takes a good amount of innovation in itself to actually get that large language model to produce the outputs that you need, right? And I think this is where, right, I'm seeing my clients differentially invest, right? Everyone's got Copilot, but this is where they're really differentially investing. Say, how do I make this a competitive advantage? Bringing this back to operations and bringing this back to supply chain, right? We've all lived through a tremendous period of uncertainty and volatility, right? Tough to get product to the places that we needed to. And those that could had a significant competitive advantage in the market, right? Again, not easy to just go in and again prompt and type and say, tell me where the next stock out would be, right? You're not going to get anything back that's useful, at least. You may get something back, but it's not going to be useful. Feeding it your data, feeding it the parameters that are important for you, feeding it the constraints that are important for you, and then engineering the prompts associated with it to get useful results from it is a different science altogether, right? That is a core use case that I think provides a competitive advantage that is not going to be easy for others to replicate, right? Over a period of time, might you have, an SAP or, an Era or an O9 or one of these companies essentially come in and say, look, I've built that for you and you can access it? Maybe, right? But they're not there today, right? And I do think of this as one of those black swan events, right? So I think the folks that can master this first really are creating a competitive advantage for themselves. And as I said, the barrier to entry is low over here, right? I think everyone can do this today within their respective organizations, right? So the folks that are investing over here, I think really will see outsized returns on that front. Yeah. Okay. So with that, right, what are some of those concrete use cases? What does this mean, especially from an operations lens when I'm thinking about this, right? We'll go through 2 demos. The first one, the audio works, right? The second one, somehow, I feel like I've gotten my arms around AI, but around AV, I haven't gotten my arms around it yet. So the audio doesn't work on that, so you're stuck listening to my overview of it, right? Anyways, let me actually go one slide further, and then I'll come back to this one, right? When we think about AI, especially Gen AI over here, right, I think hopefully I've convinced you now to say, look, not a fad. This is something that's real, something that you should also be thinking about today in your respective lives, in your respective organizations. But I want to offer a framework around this, right? The framework is 4-pronged, level 1 through level 4. Level one, think about this as task-specific point solutions, right? In everyday life, this is us essentially going through using one of the LLMs to say, you know, write me a story that I can read to my daughter at bedtime, right? It's available, it's out of the box, right? In our daily work life, right? Think of this as a chatbot, right? The chatbot that can essentially go through and serve as, an easy reference guide, right? Help me understand and find what does policy number XYZ say. Okay, fine. Here's the policy. This is the specific text associated with it. Easy to find, point specific. Lots of out of the box solutions, easy to implement, easy to use. Level two are really process step enhancements, right? So this is more around scan the web, alert me when you see XYZ issues surface up in the supply chain, right? Help me understand or help me write the report based on certain parameters. Help me write a contract based on this template, right? It's a process step enhancement. This is proven, right? We're seeing this occur, and I think you don't necessarily have to be a techie or a codie to be able to do this. I think all of us can go do this, and it works really well. Emerging solutions, right? These are the examples that we've been talking about, right? How do I really think about that risk monitoring within supply chain? How do I really think about how do I help innovate from an R&D standpoint? These are emerging today, right? It doesn't mean everyone's been successful, right? But there's enough proof points, enough evidence that there is value there that people are able to actually deploy and scale. Going back to that 25% of folks in the market today that are saying, look, we're deploying and scaling. This is what they're talking about, right? They're talking about the level 3 solutions that are emerging, that they're deploying at scale. Level 4 is the visionary elements, right? This is essentially looking to Gen AI to say, do everything that I need to do, right? From an operations standpoint, what that might be? It's essentially to say, help me plan across the entirety of the organization, right? Integrated business processes, help me understand what my long-term forecast is, help me understand what that means in terms of investment, help me understand what I should produce, where I should move products, etc. Right? Is there a pathway to it potentially? Right? But the feasibility of this still, I think, more aspiration than anything real at this point. Right? People will invest there, right? But I think if you're really thinking about, hey, what should I be doing with Gen AI today? Level 1 and level 2, no brainers, right? You should be doing this already today. Very, very easy to do. Level 3 is what's going to allow you to develop that competitive advantage today. Level 4, there's still a little way to go with it, right? So that's how I think about this. This is the overall framework, right? So everything that I speak about with you today is either going to be level 1, level 2, or level 3, right? Mostly on level 3, nothing on level 4, right? So that's the context with this. So with that, where do we see Gen AI really make a difference, right? One of the primary complaints I heard with traditional AI was our data isn't great. We can't do very much because our data isn't good, right? And that is true, right? But over time, I've also come to accept that if I wait for data to be clean, that day is never going to come. Gen AI actually helps you clean up your data, right? It enhances the data backbone, right? Is it going to be perfect? It's not going to be perfect. Is it going to be a lot better than what it is today? It will definitely be a lot better than what it is today, right? So that's key point number one, right? Second is it, I think, can help augment and enhance the overall analytics across your operations. All of us probably familiar with demand forecasting, right? There is inherently, some challenges with demand forecasting. We never have all the parameters that are relevant for it, and invariably we all accept that there's going to be an element of error with it. This help enhances it, right? It brings some of the intelligence that you might otherwise be missing into your traditional demand forecasting models, or it can help write those models, right, based on the coding capabilities that it has, to really create for you very bespoke demand forecasting models that are more accurate than what's available today, right? Overhaul the overall user experience, right? Whether it's really thinking about how we're doing advanced planning, whether we're thinking about how do we actually engage with this, how we're engaging with outputs, the overall just user interface is going to be a lot better. The user experience is going to be a lot better. And then deeply automating processes, right? We'll talk about one of the QA examples. How do we actually go through and think about quality deviations in our processes? How do we go through root causes? How do we actually close it out, right? That entire process, that level 3 transformation is something that I think this can do really, really well, right? And that's just one example. I think you can apply that across many different places. So those are the 4 ways that we see really, Gen AI, I think, impact operations and beyond. Looking at the clock, I think I'm running up on time pretty soon here. So I'll skip this, right? And let me actually go to the next page that makes it a little real. So what can it do, right? How should I think about this? There's a lot of work that obviously has to be done underneath this, right? But I can walk through what that is. But this is where I think, it requires a bit of engineering to make this work for you, right? If you have access to one of these LLMs, and if it's engineered well, then essentially one of us can go in and say, can you give me a status of the shortages? And can you give me a status of all the overstocks, specifically in my Eastern European sites? Okay, right? What is Gen AI going to do, right? It's going to create that SQL query. It's going to retrieve all of the relevant factories from the specific geographies. It's going to go into your planning system, right? Most of healthcare clients end up using Kinaxis, so I'm using Kinaxis as the example there. It's going to retrieve the specific plan for your finished goods, and it's going to retrieve the specific demand, and then it's going to come back and it's actually going to say, through my OpenAI interface, it's going to essentially say, look, here's a summarized version that is easy for you to absorb in terms of what is the potential shortages for the specific sites that you're asking me for, right? That is a level that's just not possible with any of the planning solutions that's available today, right? Could you go get the information? Yes, right? But you actually require someone to go through, pull a template, pull out a report, write a custom query, and then get to the same information, right? This is the power of Gen AI, right? And again, it doesn't happen overnight, right? It's not something that you can just say, I have OpenAI, therefore it works. You need the connectivity back into your entire master database, hence cleaning it up first, right? You need the connectivity back into your planning systems. You need to be able to engineer it in smart ways so that people don't give it prompts that are perhaps giving you unintended reports associated with this, right? So that's one example, right? Similarly, I could go through and actually ask this to do, help me understand why is there shortages in the raw materials, and help you automate it, right? Actually create a report and send this off to my head of supply chain planning and create a scenario for me to discuss in my next IBP meeting. So all of this is possible today, right? And that's the power of this overall, right? Without further ado, let me actually jump into some of the demos. I think this makes it a little bit richer, a little bit more real. The first one we are calling Agent X for planning. The second one is, not very cleverly named, but just a deviations manager. The first one has audio, so I'm just going to let it run. It's roughly a 2 to 3 minute video. One of my colleagues has recorded it and, voiced over what it does as a short demo. So let me play this.
Hello everyone, this is a quick demo to show you the power of generative AI and how it can be used in supply chain operations. So for instance, let's assume I'm a supply chain operator and my day-to-day job is to solve transportation and production issues across my network. Now I would like to generate a new simulation run of my supply chain, but with specific parameters or scenario context, such as removing transportations for a given item. By just asking it in the chat, the tool is going to provide me a whole new configuration file. Because it has access to the whole documentation of the simulator, it is able to know which fields to update in order to translate my verbal input into structured data that the simulator can interpret. The new configuration has been generated and output in the chat for me to double check before running anything. Now let's say I am okay with this configuration and I would like to assess the impact on my KPIs. I can ask directly in the chat, and now this configuration has been forwarded to my simulator, which is running in backend. I may fast forward a bit because this will take a minute. So the simulation has finished, and as you can see, the chatbot is now generating a custom report of my current supply chain status and what are the key interesting takeaways, such as which are the geographies where the overstock has the highest rate. Now, this summary is based upon the output table of the simulator, which are provided below, for me to double check that the information is correct. Now, for instance, I would like to investigate a very specific issue, such as an overstock for a given item. I can directly ask it in the chat in order to navigate to a new report that is specific to my query. Now, let's fast forward a bit. So the tool is generating the report, and it's making two parts. First, we have what are the key issues in order for me to build a better understanding. And then we have the recommendations and what are the next steps I can investigate. Now, for instance, in the context of my overstock, I see that I have downstream issues with the production that is blocking, and also upstream issues with inbounds for an item that is already in overstock. Now, the recommendation is also focusing on either the upstream part by canceling possible transportation orders, and the downstream part by fixing the shortages that are blocking my production. Now, the tool is making a summary of the tables that are provided to it, but based on the definition, it is also able to build some understanding. For instance, it is highlighting that an item that is in shortage in one location is in overstock in another one. So I may be able to make some shipping and avoid additional supply costs. Now, from these recommendations, I might think that solving this issue is very interesting, and I would like to investigate more what are the consequences of it. Now, by asking it in the chat, I navigate to a new part of the network, and I get a custom report of this specific issue. Okay, so we saw that using a chatbot interface, we could end-to-end configure and run a simulator, navigate through the output data to extract insights and recommendations. I hope this was useful, and please reach out if you have any question.
Yeah. Hopefully that makes it real, right? And hopefully that demonstrates, I think, what the power of this is and how does this work, right? As you can see, this is all, I think, just prompting specifically, but there's an enormous amount of work that's been done on the back end for this individual to actually be able to get towards results, as I've been mentioning, right? So yeah, any questions? If not, I'm happy to go through the final demo really quickly, and then I can just hang around for a quick chat if you'll want. Okay, all right. So one more quick demo on this. As I mentioned, the audio on this unfortunately doesn't work. This one specifically for deviations overall. And what you're seeing with this again, right, is we've got an incident report that's actually come our way, right? So we're loading that over into our interface associated with this. And what it's essentially doing is it's pulling the information from the incident report and generating that first report overall, right? So it allows us to essentially, if you will, automate that step. What's interesting is what comes next, right? What are the potential root causes, right? So from here on out, it's going through the incident report, it's reading through it, and then it's highlighting what are potential root causes. And it's giving you opportunities to actually deep dive based on all the information that it has access to say, look, I've read through the entirety of the electronic records, if you will, right? Here are the things that seem odd about it, and here's potential causes associated with it. So maybe you want to go look into this to see what the challenge is, right? Now I can go through and I can actually write in, right? Again, human in the loop. What is my description of it, or what is my interpretation of it, or what's my judgment associated with this in terms of, is it a potential issue or not, right? And I'm actually able to go through and say, yes, I've actually investigated this, etc. So it's creating that document trail that's also needed for you to be able to close out the deviation overall, right? So that I think is a really, really powerful step, right? This particular element over here would have taken folks hours and hours to go through, find the specific information required for it, investigate it, close it out, right? And that's the, I think, overall power of this, right? And next, what am I doing with it, right? I would typically go through and write out remediation. But again, I'm going through and I'm actually saying, generate some remediations for me, right? So it's generating specific remediations associated with this. Now, again, I can go through and review it. I can select the ones that I think make sense, right? When it makes sense, I'm going to say, okay, fine, let's move on to the next step, right? And lastly, what does that do? Obviously, it creates the overall summary report associated with this. It closes out the overall deviation associated with this, right? For those of you who are familiar with this field, closing out potential quality deviations, for a level 1 deviation can be, a couple of hours for someone to go through and close it out. When you're starting to get into level 2s, which, for the most part are the more complex ones to deal with, this can take, a good 30 days for folks to actually close out, right? And it's not that it's 30 days of hands-on work, but it is 30 days of getting the right information, collaborating with the right folks, investigating the right issues, creating the documentation, closing it out, right? Are you going to do it in a couple of minutes as was shown over here? Definitely not, right? But are you going to be able to do this now in 2 days as opposed to 30 days? I think absolutely yes, right? And again, that's where the power of this overall comes in, right? And then class 3 deviations obviously have some real fundamental issues with it. So likely batches that are scrapped, right? But I think when you're thinking about level 1, level 2 deviations, this is something that really helps from that standpoint. And I'm sure all of you are aware, right? When we think about whether it's manufacturing, whether it's quality, etc., we see, at least today, right, irrespective of whether you're on a quality function or not, if you're touching the product in some shape or form, we estimate somewhere between 30 to 50% of time being spent on pulling data, documenting, and following up, right? That's what this is really getting at. That's what this is really trying to get towards efficiencies with, right? So does it replace a human being? Not really. I think it loops them in a much better way. I think it allows us to push that median up, right? And again, am I worried about this one in terms of that cognitive offloading? Not as much as I am in other areas, right? This is basically fundamental documentation, right? Things that you have to be able to enter into it. So it's not really taking away that creativity engine or that ability for you to really go through and continue to develop your expertise. But takes away some of the tasks that are perhaps extraneous and not value added overall, right? So that's the intent of it, right? Again, so just as I close this out, right? What would I leave you all with? I would leave you with 3 things, right? First and foremost, what is a strategy? Really think through, where do you want to buy, where do you want to build, where do you want to embrace Gen AI as you think about the overall applications. Be clear about the value, and be very clear, in fact, clearer about the risks associated with this and what the relevant impacts are. Not just today, but think about what capabilities are you potentially inhibiting your organization from cultivating in a long term. As I said, with that 70% of people processes and right, that is hugely important. Rethink your overall processes, right? Rethink how you're going to do this from the ground up. Rethink how people are going to be part of the loop, and really think through what is the path for value extraction, right? You don't want to have a shiny toy that is really cool, but ultimately hasn't been reconfigured in such a way that you can drive value with this, right? And then obviously, I think from a change management standpoint, while every one of us seems to be able to adopt this, right, and can play with this, the change management impacts of this are pretty stark. And thinking through everything from career paths, thinking through how do you actually allow people to have the developmental opportunities they need to, right? Even if it is a very basic task that's required. Just really thinking through those elements and making sure that you're managing change in the organization, again, a really, really big element of this, right? So that's what I would leave you with. And I think I have 1 minute. So I just want to take a moment to say thank you. I really appreciate you spending a few minutes here with me. Hopefully it was helpful and informative for you. If you'll ever want to reach out to me, my name is Pari Rajendran, Managing Director at BCG. Easy to reach out to me, last name.firstname@bcg.com. Feel free to shoot a note if you want to connect. Thanks.